It was one of those nights where everything around me felt off, like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the neon lights above in a blur of color and movement. Shadows stretched long and dark across the pavement, swallowing up the crowds of people rushing to get wherever they were going, huddled beneath umbrellas or braving the cold with coats pulled tight around their bodies. I moved with purpose, my heels clicking a steady beat against the wet concrete. My mind was still buzzing with the remnants of a long workday, a constant hum of to-do lists and deadlines that had become my way of escaping. It kept me grounded, controlled. Control was everything to me. But that night, the city felt different. It was like a weight pressing down on me, something heavy in the air that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just exhaustion, maybe the lingering effects of a bad day. But as I passed by a closed cafe, its lights dimmed and its windows fogged from the rain, I saw him. He was standing just outside the circle of light, half hidden in shadow, but somehow unmistakable. His hair was messy, his clothes wrinkled, worn. He had an unkempt look about him that would have made most people avert their eyes. But I couldn't look away. He wasn't staring at me, not really. It was more like he was looking through me, like I was transparent, a ghost passing through his night. And yet his gaze had an intensity that made me feel exposed, as if he could see past the layers of control and polish I'd spent years building up around myself. I should have kept walking. That's what I normally would have done. I didn't talk to strangers. I didn't stop to look at people who didn't fit neatly into the boxes I'd constructed. But there was something in his eyes, a kind of quiet desperation, or maybe sadness, that made me pause. "You look lost," I found myself saying, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, soft and hesitant, like I was speaking a language I hadn't used in years. He blinked, his gaze shifting, and for the first time, he really looked at me. His eyes were a deep, stormy blue, the kind that seemed to hold secrets you'd never be able to uncover. There was a weariness in them, a weight that I couldn't quite place, but also something else, something that felt achingly familiar. "I think I was," he replied, his voice rough and quiet, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "But maybe I found what I was looking for." His words settled in the air between us, fragile and unexpected, like a delicate thread binding us together. I should have laughed, brushed him off, walked away. But instead, I felt a strange sense of calm, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "Do you always say things like that to strangers?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though I could feel my pulse racing. He smiled then, just a small, sad curve of his lips, only to the ones who seem like they need to hear it. His gaze softened, and for a moment I felt like he could see right through me, like he knew all the things I kept hidden, the fears, the doubts, the loneliness I tried so hard to ignore. It was unsettling, that sense of being seen, truly seen. I didn't know what to do with it. Without thinking, I turned and walked away, my steps quickening as I put distance between us. But even as I left him standing there in the rain, I could feel his eyes on me, like an imprint burned into my memory.
A walk through the night. I couldn't sleep. I lay there for hours, tossing and turning, my mind replaying our brief encounter over and over again. Finally, just past midnight, I gave up. I pulled on a coat, slipped into my shoes, and headed out into the city. The air was crisp and damp, the rain now just a fine mist clinging to the streets, making everything glow with an otherworldly sheen. I didn't have a destination. I just walked, my footsteps echoing in the quiet as I let myself drift, guided by some invisible pull. And then, as if by fate, I found myself back at that cafe. He was there, standing in the same spot, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his gaze fixed on the empty street in front of him. I felt a strange surge of relief, a sense of rightness, as if this was where I was meant to be all along. "Back again?" he asked, his voice soft, almost as if he were afraid to break the spell. I shrugged, trying to play it cool, though I could feel my heart pounding. "Just couldn't sleep." He looked at me, his gaze piercing, and I felt that familiar sense of exposure, like he could see every crack, every hidden flaw. But this time, I didn't want to look away. "What's your name?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Nathan," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Nathan." I rolled the name over in my mind, letting it settle, grounding myself in the sound. Somehow, it fit him perfectly. "Why are you out here, Nathan?" I asked, and the question felt loaded, heavy with all the things I wasn't ready to say. He smiled, a small, wistful curve of his lips. "Maybe I'm searching for something. Maybe I'm just lost." The words hung between us, resonating in a way that made my chest ache. Because in that moment, I realized that maybe I was lost too. And maybe, just maybe, we were both searching for the same thing. We stood there in silence, the night pressing in around us, the city a distant hum in the background. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of this strange, inexplicable connection. All I knew was that I didn't want it to end. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft, almost hesitant. The question caught me off guard, but as I looked into his eyes, I felt a flicker of something, a sense of possibility, of hope. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe in something bigger than myself. "Maybe," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Maybe." And in that moment, standing there in the quiet of the night, I felt a spark, a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in years. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and completely out of my control. But for the first time, I was willing to let go. To surrender to whatever this was, whatever it could become. And as we stood there, two strangers bound by an invisible thread, I knew that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. The return. The following days were a blur, yet somehow, Nathan's face stayed with me, haunting the edges of my thoughts. I'd be in a meeting, or typing an email, and suddenly there he'd be, staring back at me with that quiet intensity. It was ridiculous, really. I barely knew him, just a name and the hint of a story. But I couldn't shake the feeling that our paths had crossed for a reason. I told myself it was nothing, just a passing curiosity, something that would fade with time. But as the days went by, I found myself gravitating back to that part of the city, my feet carrying me down streets I didn't usually walk, past storefronts that felt like silent witnesses to my unraveling. And one evening, just as dusk was settling over the city, there he was. He was standing in the same spot, leaning against the wall outside the closed cafe, as if he'd been waiting for me. The sight of him sent a jolt through me, a mixture of relief and fear, excitement and dread. I didn't know what I was doing, why I was here, why he kept pulling me back like a magnet. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and walked over to him. "Back again," he said, his voice soft, almost teasing, though his eyes held that same seriousness, that same weight. I shrugged, trying to act casual, though I could feel my pulse racing. "I could ask you the same thing." He looked at me for a moment, his gaze steady, unflinching. And then, without a word, he nodded toward a bench a few feet away. I hesitated, glancing around, but then followed him, feeling that strange pull, that sense of inevitability. We sat in silence for a while, the city moving around us, people passing by without a second glance. I could feel him next to me, a solid presence in the fading light, and I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, like I'd been holding my breath for too long and finally exhaled. After a moment, he spoke. "You seem different," he said, his voice low, thoughtful. "Like there's something you're running from." The words hit me harder than I expected, a sudden stab of truth that left me feeling exposed, vulnerable. I wanted to deny it, to brush it off with a laugh, but I knew he'd see right through me. "I don't know," I said softly, my gaze fixed on the ground. "Maybe I am." He nodded, as if he understood completely. "Sometimes, running is the only thing that makes sense." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a sadness, a weariness that felt achingly familiar. It was the look of someone who'd lost something, someone who'd seen too much, felt too much, and was left carrying the weight of it all alone. "Why are you out here, Nathan?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He smiled, a small, wistful curve of his lips. "Maybe I'm looking for something too." There was a pause, a charged silence between us, filled with questions neither of us dared to ask. And then, without another word, He stood up, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Come on," he said, tilting his head. "There's something I want to show you." I hesitated, glancing around. This wasn't like me. I didn't follow strangers into the night, didn't wander through the city with people I barely knew. But with Nathan, it felt different. Like I could trust him, even though I barely understood why. And so, without another word, I got up and followed him. The rooftop. He led me down a series of winding alleys, past crumbling brick walls covered in faded graffiti and empty storefronts that had long since closed their doors. The streets grew quieter as we moved away from the main thoroughfare, the noise of the city fading into a soft murmur. It was as if we were slipping into another world, a hidden place that existed only for the two of us. Finally, we reached an old building with a weathered facade, its windows dark and cracked. Nathan glanced back at me, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes, and then he pushed open the door, leading me inside. The staircase was narrow and steep, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. I could hear our footsteps echoing off the walls, a rhythmic beat that seemed to match the pounding of my heart. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know what I was hoping to find. But there was a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something important was about to happen. When we finally reached the rooftop, I stopped, breathless, not from the climb, but from the sight before me. The city stretched out in all directions, a sea of lights and shadows, skyscrapers rising up like jagged teeth against the night sky. It was beautiful and haunting, a reminder of both the vastness of the world and my own small place within it. Nathan walked over to the edge, his silhouette outlined by the glow of the city below. He leaned against the railing, his gaze distant, his face illuminated by the soft, pale light. There was something almost ethereal about him in that moment, a sense of fragility that made me want to reach out, to anchor him somehow. "I used to come here a lot," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Back when things were different." I walked over to him, standing by his side, letting the silence stretch between us. I could feel the weight of his words, the hidden meaning behind them, and I felt a strange ache in my chest, a sadness that wasn't entirely my own. "Different how?" I asked, my voice soft, careful. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the city, his eyes tracing the patterns of light and shadow, the endless sprawl of buildings and streets. "I had a family once," he said finally, his voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "A daughter. She was everything to me. But I lost her." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, letting his pain wash over me, feeling it as if it were my own. "I lost everything after that," he continued, his voice barely audible. "My job, my home, my sense of who I was. It all just fell apart. And now, I'm here." He turned to look at me then, his eyes filled with a sadness so profound it took my breath away. This wasn't just a man who had lost his way. This was a man who had been broken, who had been through a kind of suffering I couldn't even begin to imagine. "I'm sorry," I whispered, reaching out to touch his arm, my fingers brushing against the worn fabric of his jacket. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." He looked down at my hand, his expression softening, and for a moment, I thought he might reach out, might let me in just a little bit more. But then he pulled away, his face hardening. It's just life, I guess," he said, his voice flat, resigned. "Sometimes, you don't get to choose what happens to you." We stood there in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts, the weight of his confession settling over us like a shroud. I thought about the choices I'd made, the things I'd given up in my pursuit of a life that looked perfect on the outside but felt hollow on the inside. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was as lost as he was. "Thank you," I said finally, surprising myself with the words. "For sharing that with me." He gave me a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe that's why we met," he said quietly. Maybe we're both here to remind each other of something we've forgotten. We stayed on that rooftop until the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, talking about everything and nothing, sharing pieces of ourselves in the quiet darkness. And by the time we finally left, I felt lighter. Like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. But as I walked home that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan was still holding something back, that there was a darkness in him that went deeper than I could see. And I knew that if I wanted to understand him, if I wanted to help him, I'd have to dig deeper, to push past the walls he'd built around himself. Because Nathan wasn't just a stranger I'd met on the street. He was a reflection of something I'd been avoiding, a mirror held up to my own fears and regrets. And I wasn't ready to let him go. The encounter at the diner. After that night on the rooftop, I knew my life was going to change. I could feel it, a subtle shift, like the first tremor before an earthquake. And even though I tried to keep things normal, tried to throw myself back into work, into the familiar routine that had always given me a sense of purpose, it didn't feel the same. Nathan had left an imprint on me, a faint but persistent echo that I couldn't shake. I didn't see him for a few days after that. I told myself it was for the best, that it gave me time to sort through my own feelings, to make sense of everything that had surfaced during our time together. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on my job, or on James, or on anything else, I kept finding myself walking by that same cafe, glancing around, hoping yet dreading that he'd be there. One night, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the city in a warm, golden glow, I saw him. He was sitting in a small diner, hunched over a cup of coffee, his hands wrapped around it like he was trying to absorb its warmth. I don't know what possessed me to go inside. It wasn't like we'd made plans to meet, and for all I knew, he might not even want to see me. But something in the way he sat there, so still and so alone, pulled me in. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and his gaze flicked up, meeting mine. For a moment, he looked surprised, maybe even startled. But then he smiled, that faint, sad smile that I was beginning to recognize, and he gestured for me to join him. I slid into the booth across from him, my heart pounding, though I tried to hide it. The diner was quiet, the air thick with the smell of coffee and fried food. Outside, the sky was darkening, the street lights flickering on, casting a soft, yellow glow through the windows. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice low and warm, like he was letting me in on a secret. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Just passing by," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't true. He nodded, as if he understood perfectly. We sat there in silence for a moment, each of us taking sips from our cups, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It was strange, the sense of comfort I felt just sitting there with him, as if we'd known each other for years. I'd never felt that way with anyone before, not even with James. "Do you ever wonder what might have been?" he asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on the coffee in his hands. The question caught me off guard, and I felt a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or a faint echo of pain. I thought about all the choices I'd made, the paths I'd chosen, the things I'd sacrificed along the way. There were so many things I'd left behind, so many pieces of myself that I'd abandoned in my pursuit of a perfect life. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. But I try not to dwell on it. He looked up then, his eyes dark and searching, like he was trying to see something in me that I wasn't sure I wanted him to find. "Maybe that's the problem," he said softly. "Maybe we spend so much time running from our pasts that we forget what it's like to actually live." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, a sudden rush of truth that left me feeling raw, exposed. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. I'd been running for so long, hiding behind a mask of control and perfection, pretending that I didn't need anyone or anything. But sitting there with him, I felt something shift inside me, a crack in the walls I'd built, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to keep running. A glimpse of vulnerability. The silence between us grew heavy, charged with unspoken words and buried feelings. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unflinching, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't need to put up a front. I could just be. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, like standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump but unsure of where I'd land. Nathan set his coffee down, his fingers lingering on the edge of the cup, and he looked at me with an intensity that made my heart race. "You don't have to pretend, you know," he said quietly. "Not with me." I looked down, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." He smiled, a soft, knowing smile, and shook his head. "Yes, you do. You're so used to keeping everything under control, to being the one who has it all together. But that's not who you really are, is it?" I wanted to deny it, to brush him off with a laugh, but the words wouldn't come. Because somehow, he saw right through me, saw the cracks in my armor, the flaws I tried so hard to hide. And instead of feeling exposed or ashamed, I felt safe. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's not." The admission hung in the air between us, fragile and vulnerable, like a delicate thread that bound us together. I'd never told anyone that before, never let anyone see that side of me. But with Nathan, it felt natural, almost inevitable, like he'd always known. We sat there in silence, the sounds of the diner fading into the background, the world around us narrowing to just the two of us. I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, a quiet understanding that I didn't need to keep running, that maybe, for the first time, I could let someone in. The walk through the city. After we finished our coffee, Nathan offered to walk me home. I hesitated, glancing out the window at the darkened streets, but there was something about the thought of walking beside him, of sharing this quiet, stolen moment, that made me say yes. We stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights casting a soft glow over everything. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional car passing by, the distant hum of traffic a comforting backdrop. We walked in silence at first, our footsteps echoing in rhythm, our breaths visible in the chill. As we walked, I felt a strange sense of intimacy, an unspoken connection that went beyond words. It was like we were the only two people in the world, like the city had faded away, leaving us alone in our own little bubble. "Thank you," I said suddenly, breaking the silence. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, soft and tentative, but I felt a surge of gratitude, a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't ignore. He glanced at me, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "For what?" "For. I don't know. For listening. For being here." I hesitated, struggling to find the right words. It's been a long time since I felt like I could be myself with someone. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Me too." We continued walking, our shoulders brushing occasionally, a gentle reminder of his presence. I felt my pulse quicken every time we touched, a thrill that I hadn't felt in years. It was strange, the sense of closeness I felt with him, as if we were connected by some invisible thread, bound together by our shared loneliness, our mutual longing for something more. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to just disappear?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft and contemplative. I glanced at him, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the ground. "To leave everything behind. The past, the mistakes, the regrets. To start over, somewhere new, where no one knows you." I felt a pang of sadness at his words, a sense of loss that echoed deep within me. I knew what he meant, knew the desire to escape, to erase the pain and start fresh. But I also knew that running didn't make the pain go away, it just followed you, a shadow you couldn't shake. "Maybe," I said softly, choosing my words carefully. "But I think, sometimes the things we're trying to leave behind are the things we need to face the most." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite name. For a moment, we just stood there, the city lights flickering around us, the world quiet and still. And in that silence, I felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of something that went beyond words. Maybe, just maybe, we could help each other find our way back to the light. The secrets beneath the surface. A week passed after our night at the diner, a slow, aching stretch of days filled with thoughts of Nathan. I tried to keep my mind busy, to throw myself back into work, but it was no use. Every spare moment, he was there, hovering in my mind, his words echoing back to me, stirring up questions I hadn't even realized I'd been asking. And then, one night, he called. Hearing his voice on the other end of the line was like a balm to a wound I hadn't known I'd been nursing. He sounded different, softer, almost hesitant. He asked if I wanted to meet him, said there was something he wanted to show me, something he hadn't shown anyone in a long time. Of course, I said yes. We agreed to meet outside the cafe. I arrived early, the streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk, the city around me buzzing softly with life. I felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread, a pull in my chest that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I didn't know what he wanted to show me, but I sensed it was something important, something that went beyond words. When he arrived, he looked different. His usual calm exterior was gone, replaced by a subtle tension that set him on edge. He gave me a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and gestured for me to follow him. "Are you all right?" I asked as we walked, my voice soft, careful. He didn't look at me. "I will be." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken, and I felt a pang of worry, a tightening in my chest. I wanted to ask him more, to pry open whatever it was he was keeping inside, but I held back. I knew better than to push him, to rush him. Whatever he was about to show me, it needed to be on his terms. We walked in silence, winding through the quieter parts of the city, past rows of shuttered shops and dimly lit alleyways. The air was thick with the smell of rain, and I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the occasional honk of a car, but it all felt far away, like the city had shrunk around us, leaving us in our own private world. Finally, we stopped in front of an old building, its brick walls covered in graffiti, its windows dark and cracked. I recognized it as one of those places that had once been something, a factory, maybe, or a warehouse, but had long since been abandoned, left to fade into the background of the city's endless sprawl. Nathan looked up at the building, his gaze distant, almost reverent. "This place, it used to mean something to me," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I watched him, my heart pounding. "What happened here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the door, pushing it open with a gentle shove, and motioned for me to follow him inside. Inside the shadows. The interior was dim, shadows stretching across the cracked floor, dust swirling in the faint beams of moonlight that filtered in through broken windows. It was silent, save for the occasional creak of the building settling, the soft rustle of our footsteps as we moved deeper into the darkness. I followed him, my breath catching as I took in the remnants of what this place had once been. Old crates and rusted metal beams lay scattered around, remnants of a life long forgotten. There was a stillness here, a quietness that felt sacred, like stepping into a forgotten piece of someone's memory. Nathan stopped in the center of the room, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched at his sides. I could feel the weight of whatever it was he was holding back, the unspoken grief that hung between us, filling the air with a quiet intensity. "This is where I used to come," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. Back when I still had a reason to be here." I stepped closer, my heart pounding as I listened, trying to piece together the fragments of his story. He'd told me bits and pieces before, a daughter, a family, a life that had been shattered by loss. But I sensed there was more, something deeper, something he hadn't been ready to share. "Nathan," I said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." He looked at me then, his eyes dark and filled with a sadness that took my breath away. "No," he murmured, shaking his head. "You need to know. I need to let you in." He took a deep breath, his gaze drifting back to the shadows that lingered around us. "After my daughter, after she died, I didn't know who I was anymore. I lost everything, my job, my home, my sense of self. I became a ghost, drifting through life, clinging to anything that made me feel even a sliver of what I'd lost. He paused, his voice breaking, and I felt my chest tighten, a painful ache blooming inside me. I wanted to reach out, to hold him, to somehow ease the pain that was etched into every line of his face. But I knew that this was something he needed to do on his own, a wound that he needed to confront. This place, he continued, his voice barely audible, it was my sanctuary. A place where I could disappear, where no one could find me, where I didn't have to pretend to be okay. He turned to me, his gaze piercing, his expression raw and vulnerable. And then you came along. And suddenly I didn't want to be a ghost anymore. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken, and I felt a surge of emotion, a wave of something that went beyond words. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of the feelings that were bubbling up inside me. All I knew was that I wanted to be there for him, to help him find his way back to himself. "Nathan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't have to be alone anymore." He looked at me, his eyes softening, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something, a spark of hope, a glimpse of the man he could be, the man he was slowly becoming. And in that moment, I knew that I was in this with him, that whatever path he chose, I would be there by his side, helping him rebuild, helping him heal. The walk back. We left the building in silence, stepping out into the cool night air, the city around us a quiet hum of lights and shadows. I could feel the weight of his confession hanging between us, the vulnerability of what he'd shared, the trust he'd placed in me. It was overwhelming yet strangely comforting, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we weren't truly alone. We walked side by side, our footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional car passing by, the distant hum of traffic a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beat of my heart. I wanted to reach out, to take his hand, to somehow bridge the distance between us, but I held back, letting the silence speak for us. Finally, he stopped, turning to look at me, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "For being here. For listening." I felt a surge of warmth, a feeling that went beyond words, a quiet gratitude that filled every corner of my being. "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "I'm just glad I could be here." He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet understanding that we were connected, bound together by something deeper than words, something that went beyond the pain and the loss and the brokenness that had brought us here. We stood there for a while, the city lights flickering around us, the world quiet and still. And as we looked out over the city, as the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I knew that this was just the beginning, that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, one step at a time. Epilogue, the path forward. In the weeks that followed, Nathan and I grew closer, our connection deepening with each passing day. We spent countless nights walking through the city, talking about everything and nothing, sharing pieces of ourselves that we'd kept hidden for far too long. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I was strong enough to handle the weight of his pain, moments when he retreated into himself, lost in the shadows of his past. But each time, we found our way back to each other, drawn together by the invisible thread that bound us, by the quiet understanding that we were stronger together than we were apart. And as time went on, I began to realize that I was healing too. That in helping him find his way back to himself, I was finding my own path, rediscovering parts of myself that I'd long forgotten. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt like we were fighting an uphill battle, days when the weight of our pasts threatened to pull us under. But through it all, we held on to each other, clinging to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could build something new, something beautiful, out of the broken pieces of our lives. And in the end, that was enough. Because sometimes, the people who change us the most are the ones we never see coming. And sometimes, the love that saves us is the love we never expected to find.